Hi, I'm Tim Bartik. The question I want to address today in this talk is, should place-based jobs policies be used to help distressed communities in the United States? And I'm going to argue yes, we need place-based jobs policies to help these communities, but the current policies we're using don't work very well and need reforms. So I should first at the outset define what I mean by place-based jobs policies. By place-based jobs policies, I mean policies designed to increase the overall number of jobs in the local labor market area. So in the U.S., these policies are commonly called economic development policies, and they are commonly carried out by state and local governments. Why might we want to have such policies to help distressed communities? Well, the first point to note is that we have big differences in the U.S. across different local labor markets in employment to population ratio. So, for example, one definition of local labor market is what is called by statisticians a commuting zone. Those are groups of contiguous counties across which there is a lot of commuting, and so the area has a lot of commuting within it, and so it constitutes one local labor market. If you look at local labor markets in the U.S., they differ widely in the employment to population ratio, even if you narrow in and control for age by looking at, say, prime age workers. The employment to population ratio for prime age workers, which is defined as workers between the ages of 25 to 54, can differ by 5 or 10 percentage points across different commuting zones in the U.S. What's causing this? Well, some of it has to do with whether or not the commuting zone specializes in manufacturing. If a commuting zone specializes in manufacturing, it tends to have lower employment rates. Some of it seems to be due to the size of the commuting zone. Smaller commuting zones in recent years tend to have lower employment to population ratios for prime age workers. But a lot of it's unexplained by that. So we have, even within different groups of communities that are similar in how much they specialize in manufacturing or similar in their overall size, there's just lots of disparities in the employment rate. Well, this is worrisome because we know that lower employment rates are associated with many social problems, that communities with lower employment to population ratios tend to have higher problems with substance abuse, higher problems with crime, higher incidence of mental illness, higher incidence of various physical disabilities, greater family problems. The kids who grow up in such commuting zones tend not to do as well as adults as others. So low employment rates is in some commuting zones, but not others, is a significant social and economic problem facing the U.S. economy. The question is, what, if anything, should we do about it? When you think about what to do about it, you can either move jobs to people or you can move people to jobs. Now, economists have tended in the past to often favor moving people to jobs. What's wrong with that solution? Why don't we just take people living in some distressed communities such as Flint, Michigan, and just move them out of Flint to some more prosperous area? Well, one problem is it's hard to move people. We've done numerous studies of this, and essentially people are reluctant to move. They have high ties to the place they live in, their home. Even if you give them a subsidy of $10,000 to move out of a distressed area, the research suggests that might induce maybe 2% of the population, maybe 5% of the population to move out. So most people will not move even with a pretty sizable subsidy. The other problem is, what does that mean for those left behind? One consistent finding from economics research is that the responsiveness, the elasticity of jobs to changes in population is actually pretty close to 1. That is, if we encourage X percent of the population in some area to leave that area, the number of jobs will also go down by X percent. With the number of jobs going down by the same amount, by the same percentage as the population goes down, the employment to population ratio will be unchanged. In other words, moving people out of Flint will do nothing to increase the odds that people in Flint can get jobs. So why might that be? Why does moving people out have these large effects on jobs? Well, there are a variety of things. When you move people out, there's consumption lost from those people moving out simply because there are less people. There are wealth effects. You're moving wealth out. There could be effects on entrepreneurship. Moving a lot of people out means there's going to be less investment in housing, less business investment. So there are a host of these effects. Essentially, the notion that we're going to somehow solve the problems of distressed communities and move people out does not seem to make sense. So moving people to jobs, even though it's often been advocated in the past, does not seem to be a viable strategy. Well, what about the strategy of moving jobs to people? Let's discuss that. To set the context of that discussion, though, I first want to talk a little bit about the jobs to people strategies we currently use in the U.S. And the main such strategy we currently use in the U.S. are state and local business incentives. What do I mean by business incentives? These are either tax incentives or cash grants that are given by state and local governments to individual businesses in order to encourage them to either create jobs in that local economy or to retain jobs in that local economy. Now, these incentives have tripled over the last 30 years. They're up to about $50 billion a year. More worrisome is that some offers that have been made, for example, the offer made by Wisconsin to the Foxconn Manufacturing Company, or some of the offers to Amazon when they were locating their so-called headquarters too, were some of these offers made to either Foxconn or Amazon were 10 times as large in cost per job as the typical incentive in the United States. If incentives of that magnitude became the norm, the annual cost of business incentives in the U.S. would go up from the current $50 billion to about $500 billion. That $500 billion would be equal to 30% of overall state and local government tax revenue. So clearly, if we had Foxconn or Amazon level incentives for all companies locating jobs, we would be running incentives at a level where it would have a significant impact on the ability of state and local governments to provide adequate public services, or it might have some significant impact on raising household taxes. The way we currently do incentives, they are generally not targeted on distressed places. States just hand them out everywhere in similar magnitude in general. Among different industries, incentives tend to be targeted on what economists sometimes call tradable industries or export-based industries, by which are meant industries that sell their goods and services outside the state. It could be to some other country, or it could be simply selling goods outside the state you're in. So it is targeted on tradable industries, which makes some sense. But it has little correlation within that with things you might think it'd be targeted on. So higher wage industries don't tend to get higher incentives. More high-tech industries, more research-intensive industries don't tend to get higher incentives. So it's not very targeted across industries. Incentives are targeted at large firms. It's the largest firms that tend to get the most generous incentive offers. And finally, many incentives tend to be long-term. It's very common to have high levels of incentives for a project proposed by a firm that would go on for at least 10 years after the project started. And in some cases, these incentives go on for 20 or 30 years. That's the current situation. We have large and growing incentives. They're not targeted very much at distressed areas or by industry. They go to large firms a lot, and a lot of them are very long-term. Now let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what might be the economic rationale for running these jobs to people strategies where we might try to subsidize jobs in distressed places? I'm going to give three rationales, but I think the most important one is the first rationale I'm going to list, which is that there's good reason to think that the benefits from creating jobs in distressed areas is greater than for creating jobs in other areas. That is, the benefits from creating jobs are asymmetric and tend to be much higher in distressed areas rather than non-distressed areas. So there's been some studies of this in the past. I did a couple studies that found that when you locate jobs in areas with high unemployment, the effect on the employment to population ratio tends to be higher. There's a problem with that research in that some of these effects are not statistically significant. They're only marginally statistically significant. And then there's a more recent study by Ben Austin, Ed Glazer, and Larry Summers that got a lot of attention. And it was a study done in Brookings Papers in 2018. And that study also found asymmetric effects of job creation on the employment to population ratio. However, there are some problems with their study, some issues with their study, some limitations to it that mean that you really couldn't use it to set government policy to help distressed areas. Why do I say that? Well, they find an asymmetry looking across different geographic areas. The areas that they use, they call consistent PUMAs. PUMA is a Census Bureau acronym that stands for Public Use Microdata Areas. They're areas of at least 100,000 in population, and the smallest geographic areas for which the Census Bureau will report where individuals live in publicly available census data. Consistent PUMAs are areas that these PUMAs are redefined after every census, at every census times, and so you try to make these boundaries consistent over time. And so consistent PUMAs are kind of a weird area. Some of them are like small neighborhoods in Manhattan. Others, when you try to match them up over time, end up being 2/3 of a state. So another way to put it, consistent PUMAs aren't very consistent areas. In any event, consistent PUMAs don't correspond to any geographic area that has any governmental power. So it doesn't seem like it's a very useful geographic area for making policy. In addition, what they found is that when an area had a lower prime age employment rate for males, that the effect of job creation on the employment to population ratio was higher. But you really can't we could never use the male employment to population ratio as a criteria for targeting a government program. That would be illegal, and that would be unethical. Another issue we need to address, though, that Austin, Glazer, and Summers' paper raises is how should we define local labor markets? How big are local labor markets? You might think that the conventional wisdom has usually been we want to use areas such as commuting zones within which there's a lot of commuting to define local labor markets. But there's been a long tradition in economics and sociology of being concerned that it not only matters how things are in the overall commuting zone or the overall metro area, it also may matter whether jobs are nearby. I mean, John Kane had some work in the 1960s, and William Julius Wilson had some work later on, arguing that, in fact, if you're living in the city, that whether jobs are located in the city versus a suburb makes a difference. And there's some recent evidence in a paper by Manning and Petrangelo from 2017 that in fact that labor demand shocks may in fact be quite spatially localized, perhaps in an area as small as a U.S. county and geographic area. So the first thing in some new work that I'm reporting today in this talk is look at the issue of should we define local labor markets as being a commuting zone, a group of contiguous counties within which there's a lot of commuting, or is the county a better definition? And from looking at this, I find that it is mainly the commuting zone that matters, although the county matters to some degree. So when we look at how shocks to job creation affect the employment to population ratio in a county, we find that it's actually the case that the commuting zones, the shocks to labor demand in the commuting zone, have 4 times the effect on the county employment rate as shocks to the county itself. So to put this in an example from Michigan, it's the case that for, say, Wayne County, where Detroit is, that shocks to the overall commuting zone surrounding Wayne County, which includes suburban counties such as Oakland, Macomb County, are more important for affecting the employment to population ratio in Wayne County than is the actual labor demand shock in the county. And these labor demand shocks are measured, as is commonly done in economics, by looking at base period and industrial specialization in each county and commuting zone, and looking at national trends in demand by industry to measure how much demand is going up for the for either the county or the commuting zone specialized industries. So it looks like the commuting zone is really what matters in defining economic distress, not the county, although the county matters to some degree. Another issue is, how should we best measure economic distress? And so in this new empirical work, I experimented with 3 different ways of measuring labor market success. So now I'm switching the analysis to looking at the commuting zone, and I'm looking at whether or not the labor demand shocks measured by changes in national demand for a commuting zone specialized industries, how demand shock to a commuting zone's jobs, how they affect the employment population ratio, and how that effect varies with the commuting zone's initial level of economic distress. And I have 3 different measures of economic distress I looked at. I looked at the overall employment to population ratio for everyone 16 and above. I looked at the employment to population ratio for those aged 25 to 54, so-called prime age workers. You might think that would be a better measure of distress because it controls for age to some degree, the age distribution to some degree. And finally, I looked at the employment to population ratio for everyone age 25 and above who had less than a college degree. And you might think this would be a better measure of economic distress because you tend to think of workers with less than a college education as being less geographically mobile. Well, what do I find? I find that, in fact, the overall employment population ratio tends to work the best. You do tend to find pretty systematically that areas that initially had a lower employment to population ratio, that the effect of a labor demand shock on the employment population ratio is much higher in areas that initially had a low employment to population ratio. Another thing I looked at was whether or not this relationship, how it varied. Does it vary uniformly as the employment to population ratio goes up or down? And I find that it doesn't. I tried different ways of grouping areas by their initial level of distress. So I played around with grouping them into 5 groups by initial level of distress, 3 groups, and then 2 groups. Looking at the results, pretty much it looks like grouping commuting zones into 2 groups works the best. Roughly speaking, I had 240 commuting zones I was looking at. It looks as if dividing them in half works the best. The 120 commuting zones that are most distressed all have an employment population ratio at least 1 percentage point below the national average. Essentially, I found that in these more distressed commuting zones, that the effect was much higher on the employment population ratio of labor demand shocks, as I said. And most of that is due to much higher effects on the labor force participation rate, 4 times the effect in labor force participation rates. That's important because, as I'll come back to later on, there's evidence from other studies that when we have a labor demand shock, that can affect the employment to population ratio either by affecting the employment to labor force ratio or by affecting the labor force to population ratio. And the labor force participation rate effect tends to be more persistent in the long term than the effects on the unemployment rate. We find these very large differentials in the effects of local labor demand shocks on employment rates, largely due to effects on labor force participation rates in areas that are initially more economically distressed, as measured by the employment to population ratio for everyone 16 and above. And when you look at what areas of the country tend to have these low employment to population ratios, it tends to be, as you might suspect, a lot of areas in Appalachia, a lot of areas in the South, Some areas in the upper Midwest, such as in the Detroit area, the Flint area, upper Minnesota. A lot of areas on the West Coast outside of some of the coastal cities. We have some very diverse areas, and some of these areas are quite small rural areas, and others are bigger cities, like, as I said, the Detroit area and Flint. So there's a big diversity of which types of areas are economically distressed. This research so far I've been talking about just looks at the initial effects of labor demand shocks. And a counter argument to this is, who cares about the initial effect? What counts is the long term. And the argument would be, even if in the short term, increases in employment in a distressed area increases the employment rate by quite a bit, isn't that all just going to be eliminated by in-migration? And what will happen is, as we create jobs in the distressed areas, more people will move in, the employment population ratio will come back down, and essentially there aren't going to be too much in the way of labor market gains from the increase in jobs. All we're going to see, this is all going to be capitalized into higher property values, and the main beneficiaries of all this are going to be property owners. Well, the research is actually pretty consistent that most of the studies suggest that when we increase the number of jobs in an area by 1%, that the employment to population ratio after about 10 years or so, or even longer, goes up by somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.2 to 0.3%. Another way to put it is, when we create jobs in an area, it looks as if 20 to 30% of those jobs go into increasing the local employment population ratio in the long run. The other 70 to 80% do go into increasing the population in the area, but there is a long-term effect on the employment to population ratio. This is shown, again, by numerous empirical work. There is one prominent exception, the well-known work by Blanchard and Katz, and research has suggested that their model rests on a specific way of specifying how effects occur, and that it's not robust to more general specifications that allow growth to have effects without restrictions. In addition to this broader empirical work, there's some more recent specific studies that indicate that labor demand shocks may have long-term effects. One that's really quite relevant in the current context, where we're talking about economic development policy, is a study done by Friedman in 2017 of Mississippi's program adopted in 1936 that was called Balanced Agriculture with Industry. Now, that program was kind of the original 20th century state economic development program in the U.S. Mississippi decided to diversify its economy by offering northern manufacturers, particularly in apparel and textiles, free land, and they'd build the factory for them. And then Mississippi would own the factory, or the local government would own the factory, and lease it to the company for $1 a year. The companies would not pay any taxes, property taxes. So essentially they would get free land, free building, no property taxes. And that program started in 1936 and was really one of the first economic development incentive programs of the modern era that states were offering. Well, what does Friedman find looking at this? Well, he finds this did attract employment to some counties. And when you look at those counties, you find that their labor force participation rates are clearly higher, at least for at least 24 years, statistically significant. And the estimates suggest that, as far as we can tell, those effects still persist until the present, until at least 2010. And that's even after many of the original factories had closed down. So it seems to increase county labor force participation rates permanently, or at least very persistently. There's also a paper that's forthcoming soon from my colleague Brad Hirschbein and his co-author Brian Stewart that looks at different metropolitan areas that were differentially affected by recessions. And what they find is a consistent pattern of recessions. If an area experienced a higher job loss due to the recession, the employment population ratio in that area will still be lower a decade later. So what's going on here? How on earth can these job shocks have these permanent effects on employment to population ratios? I think it's because of how labor demand shocks, how they affect workers' skills. And I'm defining skills in a very broad way. So when we create jobs in an area and people in the short run get those jobs, because they get the jobs, they acquire higher skills in doing work. But they also are less likely to have problems with substance abuse, less likely to have problems with crime. They have more self-confidence. They have a better reputation with other employers. Their kids may do better. So it's understandable why, even after the original factory closes down, that these labor demand shocks may have very long-term benefits for increasing the employment to population ratio in a local economy. So that's the first rationale. We might want to target jobs to people because, in distressed areas in particular, because there are differential benefits to boosting the employment to population ratio in those areas, and therefore differential social benefits to boosting the employment to population ratio in those areas. So from a national standpoint, we might want to put more jobs in the distressed areas because there are greater social and economic benefits from doing so. Another reason why we might want to have place-based jobs policies to boost jobs in some places might be if we thought that agglomeration economies varied across places on the margin when we add jobs. So agglomeration economies are productivity advantages that occur in a local economy, either due to a larger size of the local economy or due to more of an industry cluster in a particular industry or group of industries. The usual rationale for agglomeration economies would be either when we have a larger size of the economy or a larger cluster, we might have more specialized supplier industries that make the area more competitive. Alternatively, when we have a larger size city or a larger cluster of a certain industry group, we might have more ideas that are shared, ideas and workers that are shared across firms that cause greater productivity. I think all economists think agglomeration economies do exist. Otherwise, it's hard to see how Silicon Valley could survive with its high costs. There must be some benefits to being located near other high-tech firms. But it's a more complicated issue to say whether or not there are additional agglomeration economies due to locating still more jobs in such areas. So the relevant issue here, if you were trying to rationalize why we might want to subsidize job creation in Silicon Valley, the argument is not simply that it's more productive. The argument would also have to be that adding one more job to Silicon Valley causes further boost in productivity than would occur if we added one more job to some area that had less of a high-tech concentration. And so what we want to know is, are there benefits of targeting more, say, tech jobs to areas that have existing tech clusters? And now this isn't really an argument for helping distressed areas. It's an argument for helping areas with tech clusters. Although, of course, some distressed areas do have, are tech areas. I mean, Detroit has a lot of technological talent, for example. So it might be a way of lowering the cost per job created. If we thought that adding one more tech job in certain areas that had more of a high-tech cluster would have greater productivity benefits, we would expect that to result in greater multiplier effects. We would expect that because of these spin-off productivity effects, other jobs would be created into other high-tech firms, and there would be greater benefits from that. And in fact, there is one very prominent paper by Enrico Moretti back in 2010 that finds that that the high-tech multiplier is much higher than for other types of industries. That in high-tech industries, the multiplier he estimated was 6, which would justify very large incentives. But as I said, the issue is not simply is high-tech multiplier higher, but is it higher in certain places rather than others? I've been doing some work on this, and I've looked at high-tech versus low-tech multiplier. And what I find is that for the average area, the high-tech multiplier is only slightly greater than for low-tech industries. The average area, the high-tech multiplier might be 10 or 20% higher than the low-tech multiplier. But what really makes a difference with high-tech is whether or not the high-tech share is higher. It is higher when the high-tech share is higher. But I find that this relationship is very nonlinear. It's subject to threshold effects. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is essentially for the average area, or the area with a low high-tech share, there's no evidence that the high-tech multiplier is any higher than the low-tech multiplier. But if you look at the initial high-tech share of different commuting zones and look at the top third of all commuting zones in their initial high-tech share, we find that the multiplier of high-tech in those areas is perhaps 50% greater than that of low-tech. It might be a multiplier of 3 rather than 2. So a multiplier of 3 would mean that for every job created in high-tech, there are 2 other jobs created in the local economy. If the multiplier is 2 for low-tech, it means for every job created in low-tech, 1 more job is created in the local economy. So, I mean, potentially at least some high-tech areas can gain from this. But the evidence is that this is no greater for Silicon Valley than it is, say, for Denver or the Twin Cities or, for that matter, Detroit. In other words, there are no special benefits to subsidizing high-tech in Silicon Valley. Those benefits also exist for at least a third of the commuting zones in the U.S. Okay, so that's the second rationale. We might want to subsidize jobs in particular places. We might want to subsidize jobs in the top third of all places in high tech. And in some cases, if a distressed area happens to have high tech, this would be a way of lowering the cost of creating jobs in high tech areas by targeting high tech industries for job creation. Another reason we might think there are some failures of private markets to create enough jobs would be if there are failures in the market for business inputs. So, businesses produce using a variety of inputs. They have inputs, for example, of information and training and land, public infrastructure they use. And there's no reason to think that all these business inputs are provided optimally. So, for example, companies may, especially small and medium-sized companies, may not be able to finance all the job training they would like to do or know how to do it. Smaller companies may not get the right business advice from consultants. Land is extensively regulated in the U.S., and there's no reason to think that necessarily we have adequate supplies of zone land for industry. And infrastructure, of course, is generally publicly provided, and it may not be adequate. So, I've done some research looking at this, and then trying to look at the relative cost of creating jobs through tax incentives versus some of these alternatives. And what I find is that we can create jobs much more cheaply through customized training, job training programs where community colleges provide new and expanding firms with training customized to the worker needs, or through manufacturing extension where manufacturing extension offices provide small and medium-sized manufacturers with advice on how to improve their competitiveness. We also find effects of empowerment zones, which provided help to redevelop neighborhood business areas in distressed neighborhoods. Brownfield redevelopment, where we tried to clean up land and make it available development. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, which provided a lot of electrification and other infrastructure. All of these programs have been shown to have pretty low cost per job created compared to the average business tax incentive. So we're talking about costs that might be 1/10 to 1/5 of the cost per job created of tax incentives. So potentially, at least, we can save a lot of money in creating jobs if, rather than providing tax incentives, we provide these services. Now, I want to add that they need to be high quality services. No one's saying that if the infrastructure is the proverbial bridge to nowhere, that will help build a strong economy in a local area. No one is saying that if the customized training is of poor quality, that will create a lot of jobs. No one is saying that if the manufacturing extension office provides poor advice, that's going to create any jobs. So you do need to make sure these services are high quality, but potentially, at least, if you want to create jobs, you can do so more effectively more cost effectively if you do some of these services and land provision and increasing the quality of land than simply handing out cash. Based on all this, how do I think states should reform incentives? Well, first of all, I think incentives should be states that are more distressed should provide higher incentives to states that are less distressed. Within states, states should target more distressed areas. Why should they do that? Because the social benefits of doing so are going to be greater. States should also selectively target high-tech firms in high-tech areas. States should cut back on some of these long-term incentives. Why should they cut back on long-term incentives? There's some evidence that firms are pretty myopic in making location expansion decisions, so the tax incentive you hand out in year 10 of a project will not have much effect. In addition, I think long-term incentives are too tempting because governors and mayors in this way can take credit for a project by providing the incentive, and yet a lot of the costs they can push off onto the next governor or mayor. I don't think there's any real reason, except political, that states should favor larger firms over smaller firms. And I think states should rely a lot more on services that enhance business inputs, such as some of these business services and infrastructure and skills development. And finally, I think we should try to evaluate these incentives much more rigorously than we currently do, and evaluate these services much more rigorously than we currently do. Are any states actually doing this? And yeah, I think there are signs that some places are starting to get a little smarter in how they design their economic development programs, their place-based jobs programs. So one example would be Virginia's offer for Amazon headquarters too. What did Virginia do? Its incentives were considerably less than the average state. They provided incentives of about $20,000 per job in cash. The national average is closer to $50,000. So, Virginia offered incentives that would have been, depending on the size of the project, at least $550 million initially and maybe $750 million when the Amazon facility expands. But that's a lot of money, but it was only $20,000 per job, and furthermore, that amount of money was far less than what other states offered. So, for example, Maryland offered reportedly around $7 billion in cash. The other point I want to make is that Virginia didn't just offer cash; they actually provided more of the package was in the form of various services. They had the $507 million in cash. There was another $1.3 billion or so in various public services, such as adding a new campus of Virginia Tech to Northern Virginia, upgrading the computer science offerings at the state universities and in the K-12 system, putting in investments in the metro stop near the Amazon location, as well as in the highways surrounding there. So all of that, all of those different services and infrastructure, it seems to me exactly what you want to do. First of all, some of these training efforts will probably mean that a higher percentage of the jobs created by Amazon will go to Virginia residents. So there's going to be more upward pressure on the employment population ratio and less in-migration. So that'll be good for Virginia residents, higher social benefits for the area. The other thing to note is that these training and infrastructure improvements and educational improvements will be useful even if the Amazon location proves disappointing in terms of the number of jobs created, or I suppose at the extreme if Amazon disappears from the economy in 20 years. Seems unlikely now, but who knows. The point is that putting a new campus Virginia Tech in, upgrading computer science offerings in the educational system, putting in improvements in the metro and highways, all these are things that are likely to pay off for Virginia, even without the Amazon facility. So I think that on the whole, the Virginia package shows a superior way to approach economic development than what most states are typically doing. Another recent example of local areas taking a hard look at incentives, Nashville, Tennessee happens to have a new mayor, and the mayor said when he came in that he wants to cut back on incentives. And the argument is Nashville already has plenty of job growth. They already have problems in dealing with the growth they do have in terms of building new infrastructure, in terms of housing prices escalating, in terms of traffic being congested. So he said, let's cut back on the incentives. We don't need to be incentivizing job creation so much. And I think that makes sense. Areas that are booming, that already have lots of job creation, don't need necessarily to subsidize more of it. On the other hand, we want to subsidize more job creation in areas that are economically distressed, that lack jobs. Okay, so I've advocated for a certain type of policy, which is states should voluntarily restrict incentives that they're booming. States should target incentives to distressed areas. Should the federal government intervene? It's commonly argued that this is simply a zero-sum game. There's some inefficiency. It's actually the case that if state and local governments were acting in their own interest, there wouldn't be really a problem with this competition for jobs. The areas that need the jobs the most would subsidize it the most. The areas that didn't need the jobs would not subsidize it. The whole system would tend to redistribute economic activity to distressed areas. There would be some distributional issues with this. In other words, that system under which distressed areas have to subsidize jobs by themselves does tend to put an economic burden on distressed areas that already are struggling economically, and also transfers some of the benefits from this competition to owners of capital by a higher incentives than otherwise would occur. So I think there's some problems with this from a distributional perspective. But the bigger problem is this is not what's happening. Even though it's in the interest of state and local areas for distressed areas to offer higher incentives, that's not happening. What is happening is every area is handing out incentives, including non-distressed areas. A lot of them are going disproportionately to large firms, and a lot of them are long-term. And what's going on is that governors and mayors everywhere feel they can gain politically by offering high incentives to large firms, paid for by the next governor or mayor. So politically, the kind of policies we see don't really make much sense. So you could think about having the federal government intervene. The intervention I would suggest is that the federal government could set up criteria for designated distressed areas based on employment to population ratios, say by county or by commuting zone. And the federal government could provide a block grant to such areas with some matching requirements. And that block grant would, if a state wanted to receive a block grant for distressed areas, it would have to agree to cut back on excessive long-term incentives for the largest firms. There are about 1,500 companies in the U.S. that have more than 10,000 employees in each company. So that's a manageable number to regulate. We could simply say, look, it's not really in the national interest for states to be competing to provide lots of incentives to Amazon or Google or whoever, any of these very large firms. We're already concerned about the market power of large firms. Why should we have a system where these large firms get the largest incentives? So the block grant would provide, if a state wanted a block grant, it would have to agree to some of these restrictions. The block grant could be evaluated using a technique that in economics is called regression discontinuity design. In other words, we could have a system under which the federal government would score the economic distress of different local labor markets in the U.S. and set a cutoff below which you'd receive a block grant and above which you wouldn't. And we could evaluate the block grant by comparing the economic performance over a 10-year period, say, of areas that just made the cutoff versus just missed. And I've done some analysis that shows that if we had a block grant of, say, 20, 30, 40 billion a year for 10 to 20 years, that might be a realistic figure that would actually significantly help create jobs in distressed areas, enough to really make a difference to the employment to population ratio. Now, I'm not optimistic the federal government will do this. I'm not optimistic that every state will make the needed reforms. What might help us move us towards the needed reforms? Well, I think the first step, as numerous people have pointed out, including Greg Leroy of Good Jobs First, he's the one I first heard really pushing this idea, is transparency. We need to have complete transparency in what's going on in economic development, what incentives are being offered into what firms, and what are the job creation results. We need to couple that with really good evaluation. We need to evaluate these programs in a hard-headed way and explain to the public what these programs are doing and what they cost. In other words, with transparency and good evaluation, the public will have a greater understanding of what's going on in the area of economic development in the U.S. and what it's truly costing the public. I don't think the public has an understanding of that right now. Incentives tend to be quite popular among voters because they like the idea of a governor and mayor doing something to increase job creation. That's understandable. Job creation is valuable. It is not clear to me that the public fully understands the cost of these programs or fully understand that a lot of these incentives are not necessarily achieving the job creation results they want. I also think we need to have some well-developed alternatives to simply handing out cash incentives, and I've already outlined some of those. We can provide some of these business services, customized job training, manufacturing extension. We can do more land development activities, clean up brownfields, et cetera. In other words, I don't think you can take the current incentives and get rid of them and replace them with nothing. People want something to be done about job creation. You need to offer a positive program for how areas can, in a cost-effective way, increase job creation, especially in the distressed areas where it is most needed. And finally, I think we may have more rational decision-making about this area in cases where the Federal Reserve and the federal government do their utmost to maintain a full employment macroeconomic environment. If we're able to keep the overall national unemployment rate pretty low, get the macroeconomy doing pretty well, we may be able to get state and local areas, at least the more prosperous areas, to agree to voluntarily cut back on their incentives. And you see some signs of this in the current economy. Kansas and Missouri for years have had a running battle fighting over firms in the Kansas City area and bidding firms back and forth across the border. And they recently were able to agree to a compact to cut back on their incentive offerings in this game they've been playing. I think that kind of cooperative effort is facilitated by having an overall macro environment which has low unemployment. So I think the way forward I would like to see is let's let the public know what these incentives cost and what they're doing. Let's try to explain to the public that there are alternative policies that can also create jobs in distressed areas. There is something that we can do. Ideally, the federal government intervene, but failing that, hopefully by encouraging transparency and evaluation and explaining to the public what the alternatives are, state and local governments on their own, even without federal intervention, will make needed reforms. And I think all of this is likely to be facilitated if we have a real full employment economy in the United States as a whole. Thank you.